Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Thomas Smejka will defend the academic thesis, No Snooze, You Lose, Sleep Problems After Stroke and Avenues for Treatment. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you, Pro-Rector, members of the opposition, supervisors, friends and family. Here we go. I will now summarize what we've been doing kind of for the last 9 years. So naturally, I'll do that perfectly for you in 15 minutes. So as you can tell from the title, we're looking at sleep problems after stroke. So to give you a bit of an overview of the role of sleep, I probably don't have to tell you already how important sleep is. It only takes one night of bad sleep to radicalize someone to the virtues of sleep. But generally, there are 3 areas that we can kind of highlight here. So the first being, it's good for our physical and mental health. Good sleep is associated with regulating bodily functions and can help with reducing risk for things like heart disease and dementia. But specifically also within the mental health category, sleep is good for our emotional regulation. If you've ever had a fight with a partner, then gone to bed, gone to sleep, felt better the day after, that's because during sleep, we are able to regulate our emotions. So sleep also helping in saving a lot of marriages, in theory. And lastly, it's also good for our memory. If you learn a task, then you're given the opportunity to sleep and then have a go at that task again. You'll do better than if you were kept awake for that period. So we're particularly interested in sleep following stroke. So to give you a bit of a background of what stroke is a neurological event that happens when the brain is deprived of oxygen. This happens either through a clot or a bleed where oxygen-rich blood is not able to get to certain parts of the brain. This leads to areas of cells dying and then surrounding areas decaying. And this leads to a number of different impairments on the basis of where the location of the stroke happens. But particularly, we've heard from a lot of stroke survivors that they have problems with their sleep. And theoretically speaking, there are 3 sort of different ways that a stroke might impact someone's sleep. So the first could be direct neurological damage. So a part of the brain that is used for regulating sleep is damaged by the stroke. Secondly, you could have indirect neurological damage. So a part of the brain that is used for something like mobility, if that is damaged, maybe somebody can't roll over to find a comfortable place to be in bed, or perhaps they're less active throughout the day, and that means they don't have enough tiredness or exhaustion when it comes to bedtime. And then lastly, environmental changes. So spending a few nights in a hospital might disrupt someone's sleep, but also if somebody stops going to work on the basis of their stroke, that might also disrupt their daily routine, and that will impact their ability to sleep sort of as an add-on to that. So within established research, there was already a relatively good understanding that in the acute phase of stroke, so within the first 6 months of stroke, sleep has been impacted for people. So studies have shown that stroke survivors have lower sleep time, more time spent in bed not sleeping, more nightly awakenings, and a longer time spent in the lighter sleep stages. And it's more sort of understood that in the deeper sleep stages, we get that sort of restorative sleep that makes us feel well rested. So that's what we knew about the acute phase, but then naturally that leads to the question, what about sleep in the chronic stage? So after 6 months, well, great question. I'm glad you asked, because that is the aim of what we looked at in chapter 3. So there we compared groups of stroke survivors and people of similar ages who had not had strokes, and we measured their sleep via wrist-worn actigraphy. So this is a sleep watch that measures your movement, and then we can infer sleep from periods of inactivity throughout the night. We also asked them to keep sleep diaries, just telling us the times they went to bed and the times they got up. And we also asked them to fill out a sleep questionnaire that gives us an idea of their sleep quality kind of more generally. When we look at the results here from the actigraphy, we saw that actually, in our study, the stroke group had a longer sleep duration than the controls. However, this was also associated with more disrupted sleep. So even though we were sleeping for longer, this was not as good quality. That was also reflected in the subjective quality ratings from the questionnaires, where we saw that there was a larger or higher sleep quality reported by the control group. So because we were able to establish that there were still sleep problems even into the chronic phase, the next question is, okay, well, what can we do about it? How do we treat it? At the moment, the gold standard treatment for insomnia is cognitive behavior therapy. And when we talk about insomnia, we mean a long-running problem, initiating sleep, so getting to sleep quickly, maintaining sleep throughout the night, so you might wake up a lot, and then also not feeling very well rested throughout the day. So those sort of main three components of insomnia. So cognitive behavior therapy is a therapy aimed to address this, and it kind of tackles three main components. The first being somebody's thoughts, so do they have any dysfunctional thoughts about sleep that then maybe keep them awake? Secondly, we also look at their feelings. Great animation, that, isn't it? And so this might be if somebody is particularly stressed at night, and that might keep them awake. And then lastly, we also look at their behaviors. So what kind of things do they do in their daily routines that might impact their sleep? Traditionally, this is done with weekly face-to-face sessions with a therapist, which, while it's been shown to work, is perhaps not ideal for stroke survivors who might have difficulty with mobility, so traveling in to seeing a therapist once a week might be quite burdensome. And also, fundamentally, we don't have enough therapists who are trained in giving insomnia, CBT for people who have insomnia. So one of the ways that we can kind of scale this treatment up is to look at digital cognitive behavior therapy. So this would be digital programs that are either given via a computer or maybe an app, and have already been shown to work quite well within populations of insomniacs. One program in particular that I'll highlight to you is Sleepio, and you can see there the mascot, the prof, who is the animated character who delivers the advice in this program. Sleepio is a 6-week program that covers areas looking at somebody's thoughts, daily schedule, lifestyle, and bedroom, so really matching some of the ideas from standard CBT. Alongside this, users are asked to fill out a daily sleep diary, so they get a percentage score of how much time that they're spending in bed that they're actually sleeping. So they want to get as high a percentage of that as possible, and they can track that over time. So while this has been shown to work for people with insomnia, it had not yet been tested for people who've had a stroke. So we wanted to have a look at whether or not Sleepio would actually be usable, so physically accessible, for people who might have different symptoms after a stroke. So in chapter 5, we interviewed 11 stroke survivors who were given access to Sleepio for as long as they needed to complete the program. And then we came either to them in their houses, or they came to us for an interview where we asked about their experiences using Sleepio, and then we asked them particularly if there were any barriers to completing it. And from these interviews, there were 4 main themes that kind of came out of it. The first being that the engagement with Sleepio was proportional to how positive their experience was. So when they were enjoying the sessions, they were more happy with keeping up with the sleep diaries, and so on. Kind of similarly, the motivation to engage with Sleepio and its advice was proportional to the perceived severity of their problem. So if someone thinks, yeah, I have a really bad problem, I'm willing to try anything that the app suggests, whereas for people who are saying, actually, yeah, I have difficulties with sleep, but it's not that difficult, we're less likely to engage with some of the more difficult bits of advice that require you to change a lot of your routine. Thirdly, there were some bits of advice that came out of the program that were a bit more impractical for stroke survivors. I'll tell you specifically about what those are in the next slide. And then lastly, something that came up were difficulties with operating the program, so some physical difficulties. Now, whilst this was a theme that came out of the interviews, it was relatively minor in terms of the total number of people who took part in the study. In fact, when we look at the main outcomes of the study, 9 out of the 11 were able to complete the whole Sleepio course with minimal help. There were a few difficulties physically operating the Apple website. This was mostly in people not noticing when a notification was there to do the next session. And then in terms of the impractical advice that was given, one bit is not to nap. So in general, we ask people not to nap throughout the day if they have sleep problems, because then you get rid of some of the sort of the sleep drive that was building up over the day. But for people with something like post-stroke fatigue, not napping is really very difficult for them not to do. So we realized we could adapt this advice to saying, okay, try and limit your naps to about 20 minutes and do it in the early afternoon, so you have enough time for your sleep drive to build up throughout the rest of the day. Another piece of advice that came out of the app is to get out of bed when you're unable to sleep. This is to break that kind of cycle of association of your bed being a place that you don't sleep in. And so, whilst if someone has mobility problems, that might not be ideal advice for them because they might be a bit wobbly in the night, we realized we could also adapt this to say, instead of just getting out of your bed and going somewhere else, you can just sit up on the covers. You don't have to do it as celebratory as the person in the image, but just sitting on the duvet is enough to kind of break that association. So overall, we found that it was usable by the stroke survivors, so we then wanted to test, okay, does it actually work? So we compared two groups of stroke survivors. Half were given, or about half, were given the Sleepio app to complete, and the other half were given sleep hygiene information. So this is information about good behaviors that promote healthy sleep and healthy routines. So they completed this for about 6 weeks, and we tested them before and after, and then again 8 weeks later. And at each time point, we gave them again the actigraphy watches to wear. We asked them to keep sleep diaries for a week. We gave them a sleep questionnaire, and we also asked them about their mood. And we repeated these measures at each time point. When we look at the results of the sleep quality questionnaires, we can see then if we look here at the start, so the two dots are quite close together. So this is the showing that both groups started off with similar levels of sleep quality. For context, 16 score below that implies you might meet the criteria for clinical insomnia. So on average, both groups were meeting that requirement at the start. Then if we go to the post, we can see that actually the Sleepio group were able to go above that threshold on average. And then at the follow-up, they maintained those scores. And then the sleep hygiene group was sort of then on the threshold line, again, on average. Another way of looking at this is the percentage of people who don't meet the criteria for insomnia. And so at the start, it's only about 20 of them who are not meeting the criteria, so sleeping relatively okay. And then that then really increases for the Sleepio group in comparison to the sleep hygiene group. Then, if we go over to having a look at the mood scores that also came out of this, we tested scores for things like depression and anxiety, and we found that there was a larger decrease in these experiences for the Sleepio group compared to the sleep hygiene group. So also, as well as their sleep subjectively improving, they felt like they had better mood as well. However, when we looked at the scores associated to the watches, there were no group differences. So whilst there might have been a general improvement, this was not statistically significantly different between those two groups. So after having a look at the fact that, yes, Sleepio is working, we can also see that it's not technically working for everyone because it wasn't a 100% response. So who is it who is benefiting from this treatment? So we had a look at the factors that were associated to those who had a better outcome in things like their objective sleep scores and their subjective sleep scores. And we found that, to give a sort of a general overview, those who experienced the improvements in their objective sleep were more likely to be male, to have worse sleep quality at the start, potentially giving them more room for improvement, or, like I mentioned before, more of a willingness to stick with all of the advice. Fewer stroke-related impairments at the start, so maybe they have more independence and ability to follow all of the advice. Lower depression at the start, which might be associated with them having more motivation to continue, because those with higher depression scores sometimes might be less motivated to stick with a longer-term program. And they also had higher anxiety. So this is something that the program addresses specifically, and higher anxiety is associated with worse sleep. So to wrap up, we have found that sleep problems do persist into the chronic phase of stroke. Digital tools are a potential way to meet the high demand of sleep improvement and also seem to be a good option for stroke survivors. But with a bit of caution, care is needed before moving away from therapists completely. Not everybody benefited from this program, and it's perhaps too early to say, okay, let's get rid of therapists altogether and everybody download an app and you're solved. Have a nice evening. So something to bear in mind as we go through. So I'll now hand the word back to the prorector.
Well, thank you very much for this summary of 9 years of work. So without running out of breath, we will now open the opposition with Professor Dr. Sonja Kortz, who is a professor in neuropsychology and translational cognitive neuroscience at this university.
Dear candidate, thank you very much for the very comprehensive overview of your work. It was very interesting to read, a lot to think about sleep when one gets older too, so very insightful. Congratulations to you and also your supervisory team for guiding you through this process. I had lots of questions, but I have to limit myself to some because of time. So I'll start on chapter 3, the one on acute sleep and long-term cognitive outcomes. So one point that I kind of stumbled over was that sleep was measured in the acute phase, but the cognitive outcome assessment months later. So what does that tell us? Does the acute sleep quality predict long-term cognitive outcomes, or would longitudinal sleep data provide better insights about these changes? And has that choice that you've made here ultimately weakened the causal inferences that you can draw?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. So just to clarify, so the sleep that we measured in this study, meaning that we tested people's sleep on the watches and the questionnaires, in the acutely, do you mean just for a small amount of time, not progressively?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. So I think what we're aiming for here is a snapshot, a cross-sectional comparison between those who have had a stroke and those who haven't. Whilst there might be some variability in sleep longitudinally, according to most bits of research, a week of actigraphy and then asking these questionnaires about an average month do seem to be representative enough of sleep to be able to capture that as a momentary issue. And with enough people who have momentary, or at least on average for that week, problems compared to the control group, I would say this does give us quite an accurate or a good understanding of the difference between those two groups here.
But snapshots are snapshots, and the recovery is a continuous longitudinal process. So what would you have done differently if you had the choice? Because I'm very curious about whether you can really think about this from a linear perspective, or whether there would be fluctuations, in particular if you have high variability in stroke survivors.
Yeah, I guess we would expect to see that there's probably higher rates of people who have sleep problems in the acute phase, that as recovery improves, then they might still be persisting into the chronic phase. I would say in this chapter, the question that we were trying to answer specifically was, we know that there are problems in the acute phase. We want to know, is there still enough evidence to show that they've persisted into the chronic? So potentially a longitudinal study would also be a nice one to follow specifically the same people, but I think we still are able to identify the main answer to our question is this actually still a problem for people in this phase, or is it just perhaps a marker of age, which we found was not the case because there is a group difference. So I take your point on the longitudinal, but I think in this case the snapshot answered the specific question we were looking at here.
All right, fair enough. So, nevertheless, one dig deeper into this, would pre-stroke sleep data have been informative? And would you change that if you could?
Yeah, so in principle, yeah, we want to know, is it the case that these, by chance, did we get lots of people who have insomnia and that's why they sleep worse? I think because there might also be a causal relationship between things like insomnia and the risk of having a stroke, it's not possible to separate these two things completely anyway. So even if we had an idea that these people were more likely to be insomniacs at the start, that might also have been the reason for why more of them went on to have strokes. So I don't think it's just fair to say, maybe the reason that this group was worse is because they had insomnia already. I think there's too much of an interplay to really say that we need to have the pre-understanding in order to test the post-understanding. And by age matching the control group to the stroke group, we then presume that we're getting a relatively similar sample of people otherwise.
You're raising an interesting point, and that was not a question that I had prepared, but I'm now very curious, and that is, why do you think someone who suffers from insomnia is more likely to suffer from a stroke? In what way can this be a predictor of a disease evolution?
Yeah, so a lot of the things that are associated to insomnia, such as sort of inactivity throughout the day, we know that also good sleep is good for helping things like chronic heart health, and so anything that might increase your blood pressure, also related to insomnia, are all of the main risk factors for having a stroke. So that, for me, would be the causal tie there. So inactivity stress and things, all things that can increase your blood pressure from insomnia that then could lead to a stroke.
I mean, this is currently also discussed in other types of profiles, like neurodegeneration, for example, where, you know, from Parkinson patients that years before they even diagnosed, they suffer from sleep disorders. And is that something that could be programmatic, be considered in stroke as well?
Yeah, I think there is something fundamental to sleep because everybody has to do it every day, that people kind of take it for granted as just another aspect of life and don't really pay attention to it enough when it's going wrong. And that, I think, could be a specific biomarker for a lot of diseases that people are just willing to carry on with. Also, kind of the way the world is set up, there are times where you have to be waking up that might not be optimal for your own sleep cycle, but you just have to get on and do it anyway. So I do think this is something that could impact a lot of health problems.
Do I still have a minute? Okay. Then let's move to chapter 4. And there was a question about whether the analyses that you undertook were underpowered due to the small and heterogeneous sample that you're looking at. So are we looking at the consequences of underpowered, or do you still think there's an absence of an effect in these data?
I think, so we have some very large groups and then some very small groups. Because this was observational, that sort of naturalistic way that things were separated, particularly the underpowered group tends to be the insomnia alone group. But because a lot of people had both insomnia and depression, I think we can still look at that as its comparison to the control group to give us an understanding that actually there is something related to insomnia and depression that seems to be impacted by ASMR. So I think in that case, yes, whilst one of the groups does seem to be underpowered, it's not that we then don't have a representation of what it's like for people with insomnia, it's just that they also have depression.
Right, okay. Right, I will stop right there. I got the signal.
Thank you very much. We will move on to Dr. Jeska Briel, who works at the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience in Amsterdam.
Dear candidate, I would also like to congratulate you and your supervisory team with this very impressive thesis. I like the catchy and original title you came up with. And I also like the amount of detail that you spent on the layout of the thesis. At first, I thought when I saw all the actigraphy plots that sleep was getting better over time, but in the end, I started doubting if that was really the case. I would like to discuss chapter 2 with you, and specifically supplementary table 1. When I looked there, I noticed there was quite a lot of missing data, especially at time point 3, about 1/4 to 1/5 of the data was missing. I was wondering why the reason was for this missing data, who dropped out, was it dropouts, or were those people just not filling in certain questionnaires? Also, if you checked if in certain classes these data were specifically missing, let's start there.
So, esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. I'm very happy to talk about the layout of the thesis afterwards as a separate question, perhaps. Looking at the supplementary material, so yeah, the participants in this case were followed, recruited from certain hospitals within the Netherlands and then tracked over time. It's a lot easier to access people when you know where they are at the hospitals. So after a while, that is something that can lead to dropout in terms of being able to contact people. This was data that we had already available. So whilst I was not the person who collected this specific data, so I'm not as familiar with the individual reasons for people, this is a standard aspect of research when you start off clinical settings and then try and follow people up after they have left as well. In terms of whether or not it was seeable in the classes, in this analysis it was not possible to find out which individual people belonged to individual classes. So we can't say that class 1 is full of more people whose data we then dropped out later, but we do get the measure points for each of the times for each of the classes. So it's not the case that we would expect to see one of the classes built up of just missing data. The other thing is we didn't just exclude data when it was missing, we also used some modeling to infer extra data there as well. So it's not the case that some groups are then underpowered at certain time periods necessarily, because the model was then refilling in those time points.
But did you do any checks? So who was the data missing for more at certain times? Were it, for example, people that have higher depression scores or anxiety scores at the point before, or older people that you check who was mostly missing later?
That's a good question. I don't think specifically that we looked at that. There was a general thing that, yeah, as time went on, the dropouts increased. But that's not something I looked at specifically if they were fatigue as well as depression. To speculate, I would imagine that is more likely to be the case. We do see more dropouts of people who experience depression, also in terms relating to motivation, but it's not something I looked at specifically. No.
Also, there was not like a similar percentage on all variables. So was it really a dropout, or also just people that then refused to maybe fill in a questionnaire, maybe because it was sensitive for them, because they had certain symptoms, or?
So in terms of the reasons for dropouts, it tended, I think, to be loss to follow-up was the largest reason for why people then were not found. So whether or not that's motivated by the fact that symptoms get worse and therefore we would then expect to see issues with something like a survivor bias in that case, without the data modeling using the full information criterion, which we then used for refinding that data. So even if there were to be a case for, as symptoms get worse, that would lead to a dropout, because of the way we assess the missing data in that case, it should not lead to the same survivor bias that we would expect if we just excluded missing data points.
Okay, so you still think that the results are reliable because you can estimate them from the other measures?
I mean, the other nice thing about LCGA, generally speaking, is that the model kind of works it out for you. If you end up with a case where you have one group that starts off with very high depression and then has everything else wrong afterwards, you might infer that the increase in depression at the start point has then led to all of the other issues. However, we did not see that come out of this data specifically. So the model often does throw up some odd data, if you like, and when that doesn't happen, then you can expect that your data is slightly more representative of natural recovery patterns.
Okay, something else I would like to discuss with you is the sleep misperception.
Yeah.
So at the end, I think you suggest to use maybe EEG or PSG measures for the future. How do you think these can maybe help our understanding of post-stroke sleep problems and also the sleep misperception you described?
Yeah, so I think what we see with the sleep misperception is that potentially the actigraphy that we were using was not the best measure of looking at subtle changes in sleep architecture. So where they go from spending longer periods in light sleep to deep sleep, that is not found by a watch. If it is the case that it is the increase in deep sleep that is driving a lot of the effects, then that's one thing that we would be able to capture with an EEG. So that would be the thing that I think is important to understanding what's going on. We could also then look at the time points as well, because if it's the case that the increase in deep sleep is what drives recovery, we want to know at what point in the program that deep sleep proportion increases, because then we could potentially highlight, it's when they get this bit of advice that is doing the most work. Something like sleep restriction therapy that happens in week 3, I would imagine, is something that is quite powerful at changing these kind of things. So that would be nice to find out with EEG.
Okay, so that's more also related to the treatment, but more in general. Do you actually think these people really misperceive their sleep, or do you think it's more the measures that are inaccurate that we use?
I think on the basis of the fact that for both older people and stroke survivors, they spend longer times in light stages of sleep, that does give us a good indication as why these groups might be more likely to misperceive their sleep. Of course, it could also be the issue that in general, we're all quite bad at sleep perception. Many people will tell you, I didn't sleep at all last night. And you think, okay, so you lay awake for 8 hours doing absolutely nothing. It's quite unlikely that happened. So I do think there is an element that we're quite bad at time perception, but we also know we're worse at time perception when we're in lighter stages of sleep. So that's also something that I think is perhaps leaning towards the idea that it could be architecturally related. And it's also nicer then that we don't have to say to people, actually, you don't have a problem. It's better to listen to patients because either way, their subjective complaints do lead to other outcomes that we want to address. So no, I think potentially there is really an issue with mismeasurement, but I think either way, we need to listen to people when they tell us they have a problem.
No, I agree. I think the subjective is also really important. I also know from the sleep misperception, like the non-stroke people, that there are like very detailed local changes, right, in their sleep, and their overall sleep architecture is actually the same.
Yeah.
Do you think it could also be the case in stroke, that there might be some very local small changes that we cannot pick up with global PSG measures?
Yeah, I think one of the issues with the way that you do PSG analysis, you look for every 30 seconds, on average, what stage of sleep do I think this is? If you see disruption within that, you're still registering it as deep sleep that might be disrupted. So that's still, even within a standard PSG, not only collecting that EEG data, but analyzing it on a more nuanced level for general disruption measures might also be something that we need to include in future analyses.
And can I have one more question? Or, okay. And how do you think that will change in stroke? Do you have any hypothesis how this would look in stroke?
As in why they would have more time spent in lighter states, or why it would change after treatment?
No, if they would have more local sleep changes.
Yeah, I would imagine when we look at something like slow wave sleep, it tends to start frontally and then go back. It's one of the reasons why we think that people as they get older don't sleep well, because atrophy tends to happen frontally first. So based on the local damage of a stroke, that might also impact someone's ability to even originate slow waves, for example. So frontal lobe strokes might then be more likely to keep you in lighter stage. Whether or not that can then be addressed specifically by CBT, we would need to be able to match that with an understanding of the location of the stroke. But potentially, yeah, that could be the location having an impact.
Okay, thank you. I'll give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much. Then the opposition will be continued by Dr. Dalene van Heugden, who works at the Department of Clinical Psychology at this university.
Dear candidate, I've read your dissertation with great interest, and my sincere compliments on the precision of your work. I think the variety in research designs and methods you've used really shows your how thoroughly and how thoughtfully you've approached this complex topic. And to me, it's also clear that you've combined an academic perspective with a clinical eye and have taken the applicability for patients into account as well. That said, I have a question about Chapter 4 and your use of 2-minute ASMR video. Given that real-world ASMR often uses much longer sessions, how might the short duration of the stimulus have influenced the outcomes, particularly in terms of emotional or physiological effects?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your compliments and your question. Yeah, with ASMR it's quite interesting because while the videos tend to be quite long, potentially the design of that is to allow someone to fall asleep to the video. If it's too short, then you get a lovely YouTube ad suddenly waking you up. It might not be optimal for people's sleep. The question of whether or not that impacts the effect of repeated exposure to the sensation is then a very interesting question. But one thing that I think we captured nicely within the study was looking primarily at if this sensation is experienced, even just once, does that have enough of an impact to see a reduction in the sort of cognitive arousal and their mood levels? And that is what we then did tend to see. There was a nice variation between those who did experience ASMR and those who did not. So I think in this case, it seems to be enough evidence to suggest actually experiencing the sensation, even if it is just the once or within a 2-minute time frame, that does seem to be enough to have an effect on your arousal and mood.
Okay, thank you. And given that ASMR and misophonia can be triggered by similar stimuli, how do you interpret individual variability in reactions to the same ASMR content?
Yeah, so I think because ASMR sounds are often quite intimate, right? So somebody, I'm not going to do an impression now, don't worry. Somebody whispering very close to a microphone, I won't do it. That is something that if you feel comfortable with someone, that intimacy could be comforting. But if somebody approached you on the street and started whispering in your ear, that same sound in a new context is now horrifying. So I think because of the way that the sounds are designed for closeness, if you feel that closeness and that sort of connection, that's something that could then have a positive effect, but yet the same sound, separate context, nightmare.
Thank you. Do you have time for one more question? Given that you saw stronger effects in participants with depression, do you see ASMR as a complementary or an alternative intervention to CBT, for example? And if so, how could future research isolate like the active ingredients of that content?
As a complete alternative, I would be hesitant to say that it's at the same level as something like CBT, which really addresses a lot of thought patterns. As an adjunct, I think that is potentially something that could be recommended to people as a relaxation tool, but also again, coming back to that intimacy, there seems to be something about potentially a connection that you might feel to another person that might help with feelings of isolation. A lot of the ASMR videos focus on people doing positive affirmations towards someone, which also might address feelings of depression. And I think there are some hypotheses that it relates to evolutionary aspects of sort of ape, sort of having apes picking through your hair, that sort of social bonding, that social grooming, that then seems to be reflected in the same kind of sensation as someone playing with your hair is very similar to the sensation of ASMR. So that closeness that you might feel to someone else could be the reason why it's helping people with depression. So as an adjunct to other therapies, I think that could be something that could be recommended to people to try out. But I don't think it would be on a prescription line yet to take over from CBT.
Okay, thank you. I'll give the word back to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you very much. And then the opposition will be continued by Professor Lucy Wiggs, who is a professor in psychology at Oxford Brookes University.
Thank you very much. And my congratulations both to you, dear candidate, and to your supervisors for some really interesting work and a beautifully clear thesis as well, which I really enjoyed reading. And I found it encouraging that, having read your acknowledgements and the more personal bits at the end of the thesis, that I think you've got a future career as a popular writer as well, possibly. I do have some questions. So in the RCT, you mentioned that number of people had, or you gave the number of people who'd completed different numbers of sessions of the CBTI. What did you mean by completed? What does that cover?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. So yeah, within Sleepio there are 6 sessions that they follow along, and each session has a look at something that is slightly different. So the first one's introductory. Session 3 encourages people to try sleep restriction therapy. Some of the later ones focus on mood. By running through all, so when you watch the first video, a timer starts that 1 week goes by until the next session is available to you. Once that week is done, you can then access video 2, and that goes on. So after 6 weeks is the most efficient you could complete the program. So in this case, complete means watched all of the sessions with the prof.
So does watching the sessions mean that they enacted any behaviour change, though?
In theory, we hope that they did, that they give, the professor looks somewhat at your sleep diary data and then says, here are some things that we want you to try now about mood, now about sleep restriction, and then we hope that the people actually follow the advice.
And does that seem likely based on the literature out there in terms of behaviour change and how people follow information?
Yeah, so in terms of the behavior change, I think the program is designed and built to try and ease people in. One of the difficulties with sleep treatments in general is that there's a lot of good information out there for people, but following it in a structured way is quite difficult. So the specific spacing of the sessions is designed on purpose and has been tested and shown in other populations to work with people engaging with that. Similarly, we also have an understanding from the interview study that people were trying out the aspects of the advice. That's how we know which bits they did and didn't get on with. Yes, there is something related to digital healthcare being perhaps less engaging than seeing someone in real life. There's potentially an effect that they knew they were being observed in the study that meant that they would be more likely to complete this than perhaps if it was just a home download. But yeah, I do think that the way that it's spaced is designed to help people ease into it and actually engage with the advice. I
mean, I think in the interview study, they didn't necessarily have insomnia, and they knew that they were meant to be doing these things to give some feedback. In the main treatment trial, so you don't have a measure of actually implementation of the techniques that, did they do sleep restriction? They watched the video that said, have a go at this, but did they do it? Do you have a measure of that in any way?
For the actual sort of rating for each session, no, we don't know per bit of advice what they tried. I would also say that I think perhaps that could have been counterproductive in some way to try and get people on a very specific of what they've been going on with. We tried to make it as close to you've downloaded the program, stick with it, and yes, while it would be nice to know who did sleep restriction therapy, because that in particular is quite good at boosting sleep scores, I think having already the burden on them for all of the other things they had to fill in, it could have been the case that then made things a bit more difficult to stick with. But officially, no, we don't know which ones of them tried SRT, which ones didn't in this case.
And I mean, I agree with you. It's always challenging, isn't it? There's lots of things one wants to know, and you can't always. But I do think it is an interesting issue in relation to, especially digital delivery of interventions, because we know that telling people to do something doesn't necessarily result in them doing it, and actually understanding which bits are useful, and they do, and are associated with change, could be really useful going forward. And it could be an important predictor of outcome that obviously wasn't included. Somewhat related to that, I suppose, a bit, is that I love the qualitative work in Chapter 5 and finding or identifying that there were certain barriers and certain adaptations that you needed to make, and you produced a document to accompany the CBT. Do you know how that was received? I mean, did the document then go back to the participants to say, is this right? Does this?
Yes. So did we check with them afterwards if they used it?
Yes.
The thing is, with the advice that we gave, it was not the case that every single person said, with my mobility issues, I can't leave the room. So we gave it as an adjunct for people to have a look at when it applied to them. So it wasn't something that we checked per person if they used it, because actually not all of them would have needed to use it, because the ones who are happy not napping throughout the day or leaving the bed wouldn't have actually had to follow that. I do remember from the contact we had with the participants, they were quite grateful for the second document that we made, and they would often respond just generally, I've received it and I've had a look through that, so I'll bear that in mind as I go through the program.
And that's the ones from the RCT?
Yeah, that's from the
okay.
RCT, yeah. But it wasn't a specific measure that we included to see, okay, was that enough for you? Would you have liked other things that came out? But on the basis of the interview study, we recruited people with a big range of deficits. So we were hoping to try and catch the majority of different experiences. I mean, that's perhaps a too bold a statement from 11 people, but what I mean is that they had very different, each of them, so they were quite a varied range of people.
No, I think I applaud you for trying to take into account the individual differences of discrete groups, because I think that's so important for digital interventions and certainly CBT for insomnia, but also trying to evaluate how well one's done that. It would be helpful as well going forward to further those effects. Have I got time? So one of your sort of propositions is that motivation is central for the sort of outcome of digital CBTI for stroke survivors. And indeed in Chapter 5, motivation to engage seemed to be one of the themes related to the presence of having subjective sleep problems. However, in the RCT, their baseline subjective sleep quality wasn't actually a predictor of positive treatment outcome. So is subjective sleep quality a proxy for motivation?
Yeah, it's the difficulty of doing multiple studies with kind of thematic lines that go through them. I do think, so from where that comes from is people saying to us within the interviews, yeah, after it sort of gave me this advice that wasn't for me, I kind of felt like the program had lost me, and so I didn't really want to stick with it anymore. So there might have been a motivation not only on the basis of their sleep problem, but also on the basis of how much they felt heard by the program. So I think motivation is not only driven by starting problem, but enjoyment, willingness to the curiosity in general. So I do think that that's potentially why it's not the only, that subjective sleep quality is not the only thing that connects to motivation, if that makes sense.
Okay, no, that does make sense. Yeah. Have I?
There is time for a small question.
Okay, well, a quick question then, just about the actigraphy and in, obviously, actigraphy movement, and in your Chapter 3, many of those participants had impairments of movement, and so you helpfully looked at the difference in motor activity between their more and their less affected arm, or in other places you call it the unaffected arm. Were they all unaffected? Anyway, but that's another question. Did you also look at how movement in the unaffected arm compared to the movement of the control group? Because I don't think that was present. Was that different, and what's the implications of that for actigraphy in that group?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting point for stroke survivors. For one, in standard actigraphy results, studies, there's also not a completely set protocol for whether you should use a dominant or non-dominant hand. So we use the non-dominant hand for the control group to be potentially, well, for one that lined up with some studies we'd seen before, but you might infer that might be closer to the then less affected hand for a stroke survivor. There are things such as if somebody writes a lot throughout the day with a watch on, it might show that they suddenly had a burst of activity. But if we have the comparison to the left arm, then we can see for that person, no, they're generally a bit more immobile. That was perhaps a one-handed activity. But then for the group in general, we would also expect that there might have been less activity from the stroke survivors because they might be more inactive generally throughout the day. So I think doing a direct comparison between the stroke group and the control group would not be super informative because there are other restrictions to the people in the stroke group. There would be, say, if they have more inactive during the day, that might impact their ability to sleep due to inactivity. But in the comparison, that is what we looked at with the wake after sleep onset, for example. That is a direct comparison between the less affected hand of a stroke survivor and the non-dominant hand of a control group person.
But not the number of movements, which...
So the total activity counts throughout the day in comparison.
Oh, okay.
Is that because we did also look at was the amount of activity throughout the day lesser than the other group, and we did find, I believe, in general, that there was less activity for the stroke survivors, but that could also not necessarily be related to, arm but full body immobility.
And so, does the scoring of the actigraphy then, can you apply that same scoring to somebody with a motor impairment that you might use with the control?
I think as in for the sleep measures with the actigraphy.
Yeah.
I think so, because when we look at the analysis for the actigraphy, it's often based on counts of movement in comparison to periods of rest. So even as long as you do have the ability to move your arm at all, you will still see the difference between still and rest. That's why we didn't choose the affected arm. That would have been an exclusionary criteria if there was complete immobility, because you will just not see a difference between day and night. So using the least affected hand did give us an opportunity to see if there was actually periods of activity during the night.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you very much. The opposition will then be continued by Dr. Olaf Verschuren, who works at the Utrecht Medical Center.
Thank you. Dear candidate, congratulations with a wonderful thesis, very well structured, in an area of research that's still understudied. I particularly like the design, and I like the cover. It's also on a big screen. And it's the dream catcher, and it helps us filter out what is not useful and preserves what is beneficial. And I noticed some aspects in your thesis that you have filtered out. In chapter 4, you've utilized the insomnia severity index, and in the other studies, you've used the sleep condition indicator. Can you explain to me what motivated you to filter out the insomnia severity index and use the SCI?
So I seem to find it. Thank you for your confidence in your question. For the case for the insomnia severity index, that was used as a measure for, it's a short questionnaire for people to look at insomnia severity. The SCI is more particularly looking at sleep quality in general. So perhaps whilst there is a clinical cutoff score that is implied at sort of under 16, it gives you a little bit more of a holistic view of someone's general sleep patterns. So that helped us within the case of looking at sleep quality more generally. We weren't just looking, does this person have severe insomnia? Because the ISI is also worded a little bit more leading in the way that it assumes you already do have a problem and we're looking at how bad it is, whereas the SCI does give you more options for actually I don't have a problem. So you do get a nicer range of nothing to severe.
And have you also considered the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index?
So this also is then one that is, I guess, most standardly used in sleep studies. The benefit for the SCI in this case is that it's shorter and easier to complete. So for stroke survivors, we try to remove the burden to be as low as possible when that's one of many things we're asking them to do. So 8 questions that are, I know the PSQI is not particularly long, but you try and make things as comfortable for people where you can. And the SCI has also been shown to be valid and reliable. And so in this case, we weren't as interested in comparing to other PSQI scores, but more to getting information and not burdening the participants too much.
Yeah, makes sense. Right. Another thing that stood out has a relation with physical activity. I'm an exercise physiologist by background, and I was interested in reading chapter 3 because there you explored sedentary behavior using the actigraphy. Do you think actigraphy is the best way of measuring sedentary behavior in this population?
Yeah, in this population, that's then another question. So in general, with looking at sedentary behavior, I think the motion counts are pretty good, actually. From wrist worn, if you wanted to get sort of a comparison, then maybe you'd also want an ankle worn one as well. But in this case, we were looking more at upper limb rehabilitation as it's associated with sleep improvement. That's why we only did the watch. I think generally speaking, it gives you some nice variation in looking at the overall amount of activity through a day, but also looking at specific peaks of intensive activity, which was particularly useful when you're looking at activity over the day. Within this population as well, it's quite easy to use. It records on your wrist. You don't have to interact with it beyond perhaps pushing a button to say, going to sleep now. So yeah, within this population, it's a nice measure, but as we discussed before, there are some of these issues with okay, are you capturing inactivity due to lack of interest, or is it because of mobility reasons? So the reason behind the activity is often lost in these populations, but in terms of the actual activity counts, I think it's quite a good measure.
And you looked at sedentary behavior. Is it also possible, don't know the device, to look at moderate, vigorous physical activity?
Yeah, so we did have those boundary cutoffs. So you'd be able to see sedentary, moderate, vigorous activity, and then no activity as well. So you can parcel out those differences.
Okay, and throughout your thesis, I read in some places, especially, for example, page 68, that you acknowledge the benefits of physical activity, also to improve sleep and even mood. Why did you filter out measuring physical activity or including physical activity as an intervention in the other studies you've done?
So this also comes back to the relation between trying to find ways that we can get advice that is usable for stroke survivors within potential barriers to what they are able to do. So whilst physical activity is actually something that is advised within the Sleepio program and also was in the sleep hygiene information as well. So recommendations for 20 to 30 minutes of activity that will boost your heart rate was given as part of the advice. But like we said with the other ones, we didn't track whether or not people were engaging with that in particular, but it was in the programs.
And if you have time and money and motivation to do another study, I know you also have experience in building apps in a company that didn't go through. Do you have an idea how you can help people with their sleep and their physical activity and more in a holistic approach?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I think the nice thing about Sleepio in general, as mentioned, with these sort of like segmenting out these different sessions, is that some of them can focus more on the physical behaviors, activities that you do throughout the day that boost health in general. I do think from my experience of working with the company that tried to take an approach of throw everything at a user and hope that they engage with some of it, giving too many bits of advice at once can actually be a bit counterproductive because there's too much to do at one time, you end up not doing any of it. So I think whilst it can be a nice thing to add into the sort of daily routine things, I would be hesitant to say, okay, let's have one app that tells you how to work out throughout the day, sleep in the evening, have conversations with people socially, all of those things. And so targeting the specifics that are manageable, I think, are a nice approach. I would also say if we were going to build the perfect app, it would be something that connected you to a clinician. So you could perhaps have sort of a hybrid way of going through the treatment. Because like we also mentioned with not knowing if people are actually following the specific behaviors, that way a therapist could then say, okay, so you've had, and they wouldn't have to be there for as many of the sessions as well. That's potentially remove some of the burden from the clinicians. But that way someone could keep up and add in these things about activity and other things throughout the day if they're not addressed properly within the app.
Right, thank you. Yeah, also do it back.
Thank you very much. And then we will move on to Professor Bernadette Jansma, who is a professor in cognitive neuroscience of language at this university.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, first of all, also let me express that I enjoyed reading your thesis very much. Great work, very clearly expressed and written. Also to your supervisors. Most is already published, very impressive track record there. And also like studying the interaction between any two fields always attracts my attention, and you chose a very relevant one on sleep and stroke, I think, so well done. Leaves me questions, because you actually come from a field called neuropsychology. You mentioned that stroke is happening in the brain. Your Dreamcatcher, if you look into it from a more autistic point of view in details, is the net that I see there vessels, or is this a network of neurons with axons and dendrites?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. Yeah, so this is supposed to be neuronal connections. You can also see slightly to the left that there is a break, and that is to represent the stroke actually then impacting your ability to sleep.
Nice.
So yeah, that's the idea.
That's what I thought, and also related to a colleague's question before, related to the self-reported data that you use to actually infer anything of interaction between insomnia and stroke. What I miss a little bit is indeed the brain imaging. So if you would be able to start from new, you mentioned the mu rhythm, for example. Is there any idea, or would you have ideas to actually look into individual differences of stroke lesion and mu rhythm in cortical networks?
Yes, I think that one of the difficulties, so there are two ways of approaching this. For one, if you have an area of death within, say, something like the suprachiasmatic nucleus, you then are really out of whack with your circadian rhythm. Whether or not therapies and treatments will bring that back for you, that is then going to be a question of, okay, how much can we bring back from dead tissue? So knowing about the location of a stroke might impact what we really expect to get out of certain therapies. That being said, because of the wide-ranging nature of stroke and how many different areas could be affected, I think actually getting to a point where we could say, okay, this location means probably this location means probably that, is going to be quite difficult. And one of the benefits of some of the programs that we looked at are they're really multifaceted in the kind of different bits of advice that we give. So some of it relates to activity, some of it relates to cognitions and ways of thinking that might also impact sleep. So regardless of where the actual damage is, it's still a nice option for your program without knowing the location, because it's likely that many different areas are going to be targeted through the treatment. But yes, from a starting position, we might have some indication, actually, you might not benefit from this because fundamentally there is a neurological damage to something that is really
Yeah, but what you're just saying is basically trashing all fundamental research on neuroimaging of relation of stroke-based lesion and behavior and cognition, right? And I also get that. I mean, in the clinics, you have a different day. But still, I would like to not trash it so quickly. And then actually wonder, because we had mu, we could also look into especially insomnia and stroke, because you could study. You mentioned EEG. You said you could study EEG. You related that to the global sleep architecture, but you could even go into more details. Would you have any details in mind that you could study?
Yeah, so I was looking recently, actually, there seems to be a move away perhaps from this global idea of, okay, we're looking at slow wave rhythms globally, but actually interactions between individual networks. That might be something that informs us of specific sleep architecture that could be different. This is quite a new field, so there's not so much data in looking at specific network regions or particularly local oscillations that might be related to this. But that does seem to be a direction that we're moving in actually rather than looking at global EEG, because most PSG studies will include only 3 electrodes as their measure of which is good for people's comfort, but not ideal with looking at perhaps there might be regional networks. Yeah. The problem then also is for stroke survivors that maybe their networks are interrupted because of a stroke and not actually because of sleep rhythm. So that's another level of difficulty there.
No, and I'm asking because you also mentioned this huge variation of outcome after stroke. And of course, if you're a family member, you always want to know, also as a patient, do I have a chance? How far will I improve, sort of? And it's very bad if we always have this huge uncertainty that we don't know. So towards this inter-individual differences, in other domains like depression, for example, you have this concept called stratification, where you basically have multi-facet data that you acquire to come to a certain profile of this patient and then adapt treatment in an optimal way, rather than going on global 3 phases and global 3 phases of treatment. Would you see a way towards that stratification also for stroke and insomnia?
Yes, definitely. I think because we know of the varied outcomes people can have from stroke, what we also see from things like in Chapter 2 as well, where multiple variables progress at the same rate, to target one at a time is not going to be the optimal way to try and improve somebody's life and overall recovery. So we do need to look individually at these different things. Also want to make a point about the idea of predicting outcome, which I think is somewhat dangerous in that if we end up with models that show, generally speaking, people who have these symptoms at the start tend to get better or these don't, you might end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy by telling someone your recovery is not likely to go very well, that they then don't engage with treatment. And
Thanks.
Your time's up. Thomas Smejka, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
All right.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Thomas Smejka, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Blokland is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right.
All set? Yeah. Dear Tom, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Thomas Smejka, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached to customer law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Congratulations. Thank you. So when I first started in Oxford 8 years ago, Tom was actually the first person I met. And I have to admit, at the beginning, I wasn't so sure. So Tom was responsible for organising our lab meetings. And I thought, who is this guy who can't seem to send an email about a lab meeting without this string of jokes and puns? And I thought, now if you just spent half as much time doing research as you did writing jokes, imagine what you could achieve. But over the time, I got to appreciate this. In part because when you then left, my emails are so boring now, but also because that personality of yours is a big part of what makes you such a good clinical researcher. So you are amazing working with stroke survivors, engaging with the public. I'd forgotten about the play until I read your acknowledgements. But yeah, I really appreciate that. I appreciate everything that you've done for me. The input and the ideas have really shaped the direction of my research. You were the first person that I was ever responsible for managing and supervising, and to be honest, I didn't really get it right all the time, but I think you stuck with me, and I'm definitely a better supervisor and a better researcher because of you. So I'm so proud of how far you've come. I'm so pleased that I've been a part of your journey, and I can't wait to see what you do in the future. But for now, enjoy the celebrations, and congratulations.
There's a lot to say, as you can see. But before I start, I would like to thank the people from the Corona asking the questions, reading the thesis, and grading the thesis. So very much appreciate it, especially for the people outside of Maastricht, for doing all this work for us. So do all birds lay eggs?
Do all birds lay eggs? Trying to think what, there's got to be an exception, surely.
Okay, but but
you know the answer.
Do all birds fly?
No.
That's it.
Penguins.
And what is the capital of Madagascar?
Fadi, do you want to take this one? Uncle Haribo.
But you knew it.
I know. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but I do know it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just to see, I mean, how easily you can get into conversation with Tom. you just put some kind of, you make a point, and then you will always end up in some kind of argument. And then before you know, you're maybe half hour later, and then it's another topic or another topic. We don't know where it goes, but there's always something to talk with Tom. So that's how I also got to know him. So you were running around on our floor, and we had some drinks on Friday, and I don't know whether it was the alcohol or that it was you that always ended up in long discussions, and I always had to get away from you when we had dinners because I didn't have any appetite in the food, but not in your discussions.
You love it, Ion.
Yeah. But I really appreciate it. You appreciate it very much.
Yes.
So that's the things that is typical for you. When you engage in something, you really go for it. So I heard also about Lego. So you get one Lego box, and then afterwards he was just, I'm into Lego, and we bought very expensive boxes, and then within an hour it was already finished. Yeah. So yeah. So that's or when it is about movies like Harry Potter. You know everything about exactly what happens in it. So you really dedicate everything to what you want to know. You really want to know. There's so many examples, yeah. But it's also, for example, we every year we have once that we go for a lab day out, and then once Tom organizes lab day out, and again he really got into it. He was really, it was really, of course we were doing things that he liked to do, escape rooms of course, doing something, then we had all kind of tricks, but in the evening you came alive because he was a quiz master, and then he was dressed with like a glitter jacket. He was really doing the thing that a real quiz master. Maybe that's the other job that you could have had on television, maybe. Oh. Yeah, easily. That was really enjoyable. I really saw that you enjoyed the moment and trying to trick us into stupid questions about movies and whatever. Yeah. So I appreciate your enthusiasm and everything that you do, the things you did for the department and these kind of things. But you also took responsible roles. So we also have the PhDs in our department, and of course somebody has to be the representative. And it's not always easy to get someone to do this job. But you stood up and say, "I'm the one. I want to do it." And so that's also. It's not just your enthusiasm for funny things like Lego or Harry Potter or lab day outs, but it's also taking responsibility for things. And this whole character that you also brought it here with science and doing this great work that you did for a very long period, and you had to pull it together, and you wrote actually a wonderful thesis in a limited amount of time, I must say. So your dedication is not only to these fun things, but also when it becomes more serious. It's really that you take it up the task and you fulbring it, and that's I really appreciate. And there's much more to say, but I just would leave it here. And I think we all are longing for a drink. But once again, thank you everyone for being here. And I just want to give you a hug for all the things that you did. I forgot one thing. Last night we were having a drink. Well, before his PhD defense, he was drinking wine, I don't know. But he was telling me he was actually wearing a suit that looks like a pyjama. But I didn't have the impression.
Dear Dr. Smejka, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree that you just have acquired. I hope you will stick around with us, particularly the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience, for some more time to come. It is time to celebrate, as was mentioned. There will be a reception for all of you, which will be an opportunity to drink, but particularly to congratulate Tom. The reception is just around the corner. I think if you just follow the people, you will find them. We, the committee, will be a little bit later because we will gather first to make a picture to never forget. And with that, I close this official meeting. Thank you very much.
Should bring, yeah, should I leave these here? Or?
Take that,